let me just a second here, to the Information and Public Records Service Team Committee of the Whole. This is our continuation of a meeting that we had a few weeks ago where we didn't have time to hear from Chris Samuel on the property tax collection update. And I appreciate, Chris, that you're back with us, that you sat through that whole other meeting, and now you're back with us to give your presentation on property tax collections and how we're looking for now and coming year. So thank you for being here. And with that, I will introduce Karen Francoise, our Deputy County Manager for this service team. So with that, Karen, if you want to make any opening remarks, then this would be the time.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioners. Actually, I just want to say thanks for letting us come back and giving this update. And, you know, I do appreciate Chris for being patient, as he always is. I'm going to turn it over to him. We have limited time, so he's got a lot of really good information to share with you. So I will turn it over to Chris Samuel, our County Auditor Treasurer.
Thank you so much. And thank you again, Chris. Oh, and I will just ask members, we'll do clarifying questions throughout his presentation, but if you could save any big questions until the end, I think we'll try and do it that way. So thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm Chris Samuel, the County Auditor Treasurer, and we're going to quickly go through some information on property taxes. One of the questions we had is kind of the suddenness of the COVID hitting our businesses and hitting our individuals, is we weren't sure what was going to happen with property taxes and whether people were going to be
excuse me, Chris, excuse
yes.
me, before you start, I don't know if you do you want the screen? We have a multiple screen up here where we have the next slide. Do you want us to see that? Or maybe, I don't know if there's a way that you can just have just the current slide, or do you want us to be seeing the next slide also? I didn't know.
Good question.
But if it's not fixable, I don't think it's bad. I just want you to know we're seeing your next slide as you're talking about one slide. We see a three sectioned slide.
Got it. I think we will go with this for now. Thank you.
Okay. That's fine. We'll just know that you're talking about the big slide, and then the next one is the other one. That's fine.
Correct. Thank you. One of the things that we certainly all knew is that local governments are very heavily dependent on property taxes. And in the case of the county, 44% of the budget comes from property taxes each year. For some local governments, certain cities, it's actually over 80%. And so consequently, the whole issue of what's happening with property taxes from a local government standpoint is really important in terms of, is the money going to be coming in? And in prior recessions, we saw that property tax collections were very reliable and dependable, that the money was coming in, even in the case of the recession. And part of the question this time was, with the suddenness of COVID and the way that it was hitting folks, would we see a difference in patterns than we've seen in the past in terms of collections? And our answer at this point is that property taxes collections in 2020 are actually comparable to 2019 in aggregate. So pre-COVID, post-COVID, we're not seeing a big difference in terms of aggregate property tax collections, which is not to say that we don't have groups of folks that certainly have been very heavily and financially impacted by COVID. But in aggregate, we are collecting the money that we need to support local government operations. It was interesting that the county board allowed for the property tax deferral from May 15th to July 15th for a number of properties. And many of those properties that were eligible to deferral actually paid their taxes by the May 15th due date. So they didn't use the deferral for making property taxes. One of the important distinctions, and you'll see this several times through the presentation, is the difference between ownership and rental. And what we're seeing is that COVID is actually hitting those that are renting, whether it be businesses or whether it be those that own their housing or rent their housing. It's hitting those folks that are renting much more than it is the owners at this point. And the owners are actually paying the property taxes for these properties, even though they may not be getting the rents coming in from properties. And so consequently, it kind of masks the underlying financial distress or difficulties that we may have out there in the market, because the property taxes are getting paid by the owners to protect their interest. And one of those kind of longer term questions is, what happens if we see continuation of businesses or individuals unable to pay rent? To what extent does that really hit the owners, where they're now in the position where they can no longer continue to make payments without having some rents coming in? And so that's kind of the continuing question as we move forward, especially for second half, as to whether we're going to see impacts then or possibly into next year. And those, I think, are some outstanding questions. And the answer so far with second half is property taxes are getting paid. An important piece here is that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are being hit much harder by COVID-19. And we've already talked about this, I think, in some other presentations, and certainly you've been hearing from this in other groups in economic development, in jobs, in financial assistance. The BIPOC families are much more likely to rent their housing or rent their business location. And so consequently, the fact that property taxes are getting paid, that we're collecting the money right now, kind of masks that whole issue of those that are having problems with their rent, because you really don't see it through the property tax collections. The overall impacts are also being masked at this point because of moratoriums on evictions and foreclosures. And so consequently, folks that may have in typical circumstances been evicted, that's not happening at this point, and that certainly is a broader concern in the community about what happens when those moratoriums are lifted. Are we going to see an influx of folks that are going to be evicted, or where we're going to have foreclosure situations? And there are indications that because of the rental situation, there certainly are a number of properties that would be impacted there. And this is a point to also talk about. There was some initial discussion about, do we provide direct property tax relief, some type of disaster relief, or some type of program there to help folks that may be in distress, and just recognition that those direct property tax relief programs don't necessarily help the renters. They would help the property owner, and that property, that relief doesn't necessarily then pass along. And so consequently, direct property tax relief is probably not the best assistance, and we have a number of other programs under CARES that certainly are aimed and helping renters. This is just a reminder about the property tax deferment that was passed by the board on July 15th. There were almost 75,000 properties that were eligible for that deferment, representing about $178 million in property tax collections. So this is just a reminder of those numbers. And our property tax messaging was originally pay if you can. Partial payments are an option. If you're eligible, go ahead and take the deferment until July 15th. And we do have a one-time penalty waiver program that's in place for, once every 10 years, no questions asked, no reasons that need to be provided, that if you want to pay late, you can use the one-time penalty waiver, and that's in place for those folks. If you were not in the deferred group, if you couldn't make your payment by July 15th, if you haven't used it in the past, you can use that one-time penalty waiver. And in exceptional cases, and I want to make the case here that this is exceptional, an abatement can be requested if the one-time penalty waiver has already been used, but we generally limit that abatement approval to situations that are pretty severe, that they're dealing with medical circumstances or death in the family or things like that, as opposed to purely a financial hardship. So looking at our property tax collections in the first half, and this would have been as of the original payment date, you can see that our property tax collections were down a little bit from last year, but comparable to last year. And that many of those that had been eligible for the deferral had actually already paid at this point. And when we take a look at the second half, or take a look at the collections as of the end of the deferral, you can see that by this point, our overall first half property taxes collections were good and definitely comparable to last year. And I can tell you, in looking at our numbers here as of the second half, we have for the year $945 million in property tax collections in the bank as of yesterday. That's actually up about $60 million from last year as of this current date. And so consequently, in answer to the question about what things look like for second half, property tax collections are coming in well here in the second half as of yesterday, realizing the due date for second half is October 15th.
So Chris, I just have a question on that. If you could just clarify,
Yes.
You said that they're 90 million over what they were last year. And
Actually, 60 million over where we were as of the same date last year.
and is that just property values, or is it just
it's just property taxes?
Yeah, it's just property values that are going up. It's not anything that more people are paying their taxes now than did last year. It's just values that are right.
Our overall property taxes are up about 500 million from the prior year. And so we would expect, if we were collecting the same percentage of taxes, to see an increase in the taxes this year, and that is the case. So in part, it's we have larger amount of taxes that are being collected, so that's why we would be up at this point. But it also means that those people that were paying last year are paying this year.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner
I think, Chris, I think you misspoke. They're not up $500,000 or $500 million. Is it $500,000? You said 500 million up. That's like double.
Right. Yeah, you are correct. I did misspeak. It is
Okay.
50 million. It is 50 million up.
Okay. Thank you.
Good
Yes.
clarification.
Yes.
Thank you.
So when we take a look at those properties that were eligible for deferral, here we're looking at information about where were we as of the May 20th due date. And you can see at this point, in our groups of non-escrow homesteads, non-escrow small businesses, and non-homestead residential properties, that many of these properties had in fact already paid their first half property taxes by the original first half due date. So they weren't taking advantage of the deferral. What you may not be aware of is that in a typical year, we will have 9,000 to 11,000 folks who have not paid their property taxes in full by early June. So in a typical year, we're looking at that 9,000 to 11,000 range of properties that have not made payment out of about 160,000 properties in aggregate. And this year, as of that May 20th date, there were actually 15,000. So it was up in terms of the number that had not paid. However, this could very easily be explained in large part by the fact that we had the deferral to July 15th. So while most people had paid, there were still a number of folks that had that were taking advantage of the deferral. And as of the July timeframe, when we're now past the time for the deferral, what we're seeing is that many more people have in fact paid the property taxes. So those properties that were eligible for the deferral, 95% of the homesteads had in fact made full payment of the first half, and 90% of our small businesses and residential non-homesteads had. There were 3,800 properties that had made no payment. About 2.4% of the overall number of parcels was taxes. And there were almost 1,400 parcels that had made partial payment, but were not yet fully paid. And a piece that was very interesting when we take a look at those properties that had no payment, those 3,800 properties, was that a number of these properties had in fact already had signs of pre-COVID distress. So what was happening is these property owners either were already delinquent in prior year's taxes, or they were late in making payments in 2019. And so consequently, when you take a look at homesteads, 2/3, and when you're taking a look at non-residential, non-homestead, almost 3/4 of those properties that had made no payment this year were already in distress prior to COVID, as evidenced by these factors. And so consequently, the new properties impacted by COVID that are showing financial difficulties this year are about 1,200. And those people who were already having financial difficulties probably are having even more financial difficulties now as a result of COVID. So we had folks that were already on the edge and are now even more so with COVID. In terms of looking at some specifics dealing with the properties that have not made any payments, for those small businesses, they kind of fit the expected pattern. So we knew that there were a number of businesses that were closed by the executive order, or that were reliant on businesses that were closed by the executive order. They supplied product to those businesses, and because there was no longer the demand, they were also impacted. And there certainly have been a number of impacts as a result of people working from home, so changing work habits and changing spending patterns as a result. And so on the bottom of this page, I'm showing examples of property uses, and these are the numbers of properties that fit that category that had not made payment. And I'm going to call out beauty salons and supplies, because this was a group that was closed down by executive order very early on. And so consequently, in those properties that have not made payment in property taxes, there were 10 beauty salons or beauty supply locations that have not made payment. And this is out of 370 to 400 beauty salons that actually exist in Ramsey County. So it's actually a fairly small percentage of the total beauty salons that are in place. But if you take a look at it as well from the standpoint of renter versus owner, beauty salons are in many cases more likely to rent their space, and so they're not going to really show up here in terms of property tax impacts in that same way. The one that was a bit of a surprise to me was actually all the auto-related businesses that were showing up. And in some respects, this is a result of people working from home, not using their cars as much as they did previously. And so consequently, we're seeing auto repair shops and part shops, rental facilities, used car sales, gas stations that are showing up in this group of businesses that have not made payment. And in many cases, these were businesses that had made payment previously and have not now. So this is kind of the impact of the changing work habits and our use of cars and how it's impacting businesses. I will say that many of these businesses that we're dealing with are generally small independents, and the larger multi-chain type businesses are in fact paying their property taxes. So we certainly are seeing more of an impact on our smaller independents.
Chris, I noticed cell towers are on there. I was thinking that cell towers was really big corporations, Comcast, AT&T, although I know they're merged now, but the different big companies. Are these small company owned cell towers?
No, this is actually big cell tower, and it has to do with the T-Mobile Sprint combination. So T-Mobile took over Sprint, but in a COVID world, they haven't quite caught up in their corporate structure as to who should be making payment on the cell towers. So it's kind of an anomaly at this point. It's not necessarily related to business. It's the fact that the communication company, T-Mobile, in this point, hasn't picked up the fact that there are these outstanding bills that need to be paid.
Thank you. I was surprised by that. Okay.
Yep.
Well, hopefully they'll figure it out soon, huh? And get it their payments.
Yep. Unfortunately, with these types of communication company mergers, for the last decade or so, we've seen this type of anomaly where it takes them a while to figure it out in terms of who's making payment and when that's happening. So I would love to say this is the first time and it's all COVID related, but we've seen this kind of recurring pattern with the mergers of communication companies in the past, and it's continuing here.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could ask a
Commissioner,
question.
yeah, Commissioner Mattis Castillo. Sorry, I'm got to find my raised hand. Thank you.
It's
Yes,
okay, thank you.
Commissioner Mattis Castillo.
On that same kind of vein, Chris, I wondered about the just land category or land only 125. So are these folks that didn't pay their taxes but requested a waiver, or these folks just didn't pay?
These are folks that were eligible for deferment and didn't pay.
Okay, but don't they have to request the deferment?
No, they did not.
Okay, got it. Okay. And what I wondered is this on the land only parcels, were any of these like new directly, kind of like the cell towers? You said we see this all the time. I suspect on the land only, we see this as well. And so are these COVID related, or this is like a number that would be consistent with vacant lots?
Good question. And I don't have the direct answer to you in terms of how much of this 125 would be related to purely COVID, but you are correct that oftentimes investors will buy vacant land just for that purpose, for investing, and they may very well not pay the property taxes until it's going to be developed. If they've got some type of a piece in the works.
Yeah.
Or development in the works. And so consequently, the fact that we would see land only properties for a business small land property that didn't have property taxes paid is not unusual.
Yeah. Thank you. I think I just want to bookmark this as I've been thinking about how we do economic development in the future, is that we have these land only kind of prospected holding spots that pay very low. I mean, it's only on the assessed value, which is actually usually very low, but it's an opportunity that we have land that needs to be developed, and there might be a way to incentivize in the future. And so that was the reason for my question. So thank you for that, Chris. I appreciate it.
Thank you. On the next slide, we take a look at what's the disbursement of either homestead properties that didn't make payment and non-homestead properties, so rental properties where we didn't have payments of property taxes. And I don't want you to focus too much in terms of the size of the dots. To make them show up on the map, we're putting a dot per parcel, although certainly that dot itself is covering a number of parcels. So it can kind of create the impression that we have a much broader issue than we do otherwise. So don't focus too much on the concentration of color in that sense. What it tells us is that we have scattered impacts for both homesteads and non-homesteads across the county in terms of those that are exhibiting signs of distress by not making payments on their property taxes. And there certainly is a much higher concentration in those areas that are of concentrated poverty, in those areas kind of in the central city in St. Paul and on the west side. So the fact that you're seeing greater concentrations there, it is telling in terms of that's where we have higher numbers of properties that are involved, but it's not as concentrated as it may appear just in terms of the kind of the mass of color that's occurring in that location. I had touched base earlier about the type of relief that we provide. And this is where we have the a cross-county effort taking place in recognizing where these needs are and the need for economic resiliency, and to be assisting folks either who are unable to make their payments directly for mortgages or for rent, or those that may have been laid off as a result of COVID, or where business has gone out of business, and the resulting job loss. And so we have groups across the county in communication and working together to provide assistance, because oftentimes these are the same individuals that may need job assistance, that may need housing assistance in the case of a rent assistance or mortgage assistance, or may need help with food. And so consequently, it's important to recognize all these different assistance programs that are out there, many of which are being funded through CARES, where we are coordinating efforts across all these teams to make sure that we're getting the help to the individuals that need it and are being most impacted by COVID. When we look at as to the point that we had talked last, the property tax subcommittee had not met, and they have now. And the findings that came out of that discussion, the decision was made not to recommend a blanket deferment of second half property taxes. The sense was that it's not needed generally, and that people now understand how they're being impacted by COVID in terms of their incomes and their ability to pay. There was also the decision made not to recommend any change to our current one-time penalty waiver program. So just a reminder that that one-time penalty waiver program is still in effect, and that any property owner who has not used it in the last 10 years can request that use, and we will waive the penalty for either the first half or the second half based on the timing of that request. And we're going to continue to monitor the collections, and if anything comes up that can't be handled administratively within the county treasurer's office, we would go back to the subcommittee and make recommendations. The fact that we're here on October 12th, 3 days before the due date, and we're seeing good property tax collections, and we're not seeing a groundswell of concerns related to property tax payment, doesn't lead me to believe that we will be making a request for any type of change here. The recommendation from the
Chris?
Yes.
Chris, I've just got a couple of questions from commissioners, so we're gonna, I'm gonna call on Commissioner Carter and then Commissioner Reinhardt. Commissioner Carter.
So thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Seeing that scatter map.
If people could mute, whoever's not muted, mute their phone in case I can see maybe. Okay, we seem to be good now. I know Commissioner, yeah, okay.
Wondering if I'm somehow on twice. No, I don't think so. Okay, so appreciated seeing the scatter map and noting where the heat is and the types of businesses, and also that we are working across units to determine how we can help to ensure that if someone's coming in one door, they know about assistance that would not normally be available through that avenue, but that they may need in another. I am concerned that there are property tax payers who may be keeping up with everything else and not that. So we are hopefully able to do outreach, such as to gather those who may run into trouble later, as these property taxes are overdue and second half taxes become overdue, they may be piling on top of something else. And to the extent that we can, are we reaching out to those property taxpayers to ensure that they know about the multiple assistance that is available, and not just waiting until, they come in to us? Is there a way that we can and are doing that?
Madam Chair, Commissioner Carter, yes, we have identified all the properties that either have not paid payment or have only made small partial payments, in terms of those that are potentially in distress. And we've taken a look at this from the standpoint of not only who are the taxpayers, but who are the residents. So in the case of renters, you may be dealing with circumstances where it's actually the occupants in that property that are the ones in distress. And we're seeing some signs of it with the owner, and both groups may need assistance. And so we've identified those subgroups of properties that are reflected in the earlier numbers. And that information has been shared with all the groups that are looking at providing assistance in terms of how we get the word out to that subgroup for additional assistance. So you're right. We are not looking at waiting for them to come to ask for help, but looking at doing the outreach to them in terms of the assistance that may be available to help them. Realizing that, to your point, oftentimes someone who is not making property taxes may also not be making their mortgage payment, or they they are in fact piling up, and where we might not be able to provide a reduction in property taxes, if we can provide in the assistance in the other areas, that may then make it more feasible to make property tax payments instead. But you are correct in that this is likely to be a longer term issue. You know, we're talking about 2020 at this point, and I wouldn't be surprised to see further economic issues and COVID related issues and business related issues moving on probably for the next 3 to 5 years. That's typically kind of the pattern that we see with economic recessions, and how they hit a certain subgroup of folks, realizing that we have some that have not recovered from the 2008 recession at this point. So these can be long lasting for a certain part of our population, and we need to keep that in sight, and we need to be providing assistance where we can.
Thank you, Chris. And now I have Commissioner Reinhardt.
Madam Chair, I'd like to have Chris continue, and then if you could call on me after the report is complete.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll keep you on the list for that. Thank you.
The recommendation also from the subcommittee was that we stay the course in terms of legislative requests, which includes continuing to fund and seeking additional funding for assistance for renters, both the small businesses and individuals that have been heavily impacted by COVID. So no new legislative changes other than from the standpoint of continue to provide relief and seek funding for relief. And so the last slide is just talking about the next steps, realizing that we're not, it's not necessarily just a 2020 issue, but likely into 2021 and thereafter as well in terms of impacts. The plan is to continue using the one-time penalty waivers and continue to provide financial assistance to help with economic resiliency, and to seek additional funding where you need those additional supports. It was already mentioned earlier today and at prior meetings about the importance of affordable housing. We've talked about what's happening with projected 2021 property taxes, and recognizing that property taxes are likely to increase on our rental property in particular, and on our apartments. And so at a time where we have such a shortage of affordable housing, there are actions related to property taxes as we look ahead to 2021, where those properties that need to be affordable are going to be even less so as we move forward. And so we need to continue our efforts on addressing affordable housing. And as always, to the extent that the government jurisdictions keep their same levies as opposed to increases in levies, that certainly helps in terms of those impacts down the road. And with that, I will stop and hold for any questions.
Hey, Madam Chair, if I could just add one piece to the final levy restraint component, just as a piece in flight for members who aren't on GIPTAC. You know, the annual report around levy burden in St. Paul across the taxing jurisdictions as a part of GIPTAC recently was presented again this year. We're having a follow-up conversation that involves the chief financial officers and then lead leaders of each of those organizations to talk more about how to use that as a management tool. That's really being driven by Ramsey County, frankly, to want to talk more about that conversation in alignment with this idea around levy restraint. Because we have a tool, we're actually exceeding at times some of our own benchmarks for where we've said we want to be, but it's not clear how we actually address that then. And so there was a meeting originally going to happen this week. It got pushed 2 weeks out, but that's that conversation happening as an active piece in flight. I just wanted to raise as well.
So thank you, County Manager. And thank you, Chris, for your presentation. And now we'll go on to questions. Commissioner Reinhardt, do you want to go now or did you want to wrap it up? Being chair of that committee, I'll call on you now unless you would like to go last.
No, I think I'd like to talk now. First of all, I think for those that are watching, JPTAC means the Joint Property Tax Advisory Committee. We get used to using acronyms and sometimes forget that people don't know what they mean. Sometimes we have to be reminded of what they mean. I just wanted to say, you can tell that the Property Tax Subcommittee put in a lot of time and effort, and obviously the effort with that Chris Samuel and Alex Kritza and I'm trying to think, I cannot remember. I shouldn't have started naming names, but anyhow, there was a lot of work that went into getting all of this data put together and the ideas that were options that were looked at, both for the spring payment and then for this October payment coming up here in a couple of days. We had a great subcommittee and really just combed through all of this data and came up with what we thought was the right thing to do. And so all of these parts come together, though. It wasn't just simply, okay, well, let's do a deferment without a penalty on a certain group of properties. It really was looking at what do we need for those that are truly being so impacted by COVID that they cannot make that payment. And at the time, I think it's important to remember also just how stressed everyone was. We didn't know what was going to happen here, how this was going to impact businesses, how long this was going to go on, what it all meant, because we were all reacting to the moment because the payments were due in April and this was March when the executive orders came down. So it's easy to kind of look at it now and say, well, did we really need to do that? The fact is, hindsight is always 20/20. But we helped ease the tension, knowing that something was available if they needed it. I think had value all in and of itself. The other part is, I was reminded recently that there are times when you put something in place and it turns out that you didn't need it as much as you thought. And the bottom line here is, if you think that something difficult or challenging is going to happen, we'd rather not be right and have a flood of people that needed it. But for those that did, this was a lifesaver. And so it didn't cause us any undue difficulties, but for those that it helped, it was an important thing. And I just want to thank our county board and the leadership that we had here because it made a difference actually across the state of Minnesota. Again, it wasn't something that was necessarily in hindsight that we needed to do, but for the fact that there were people that did take advantage of it. And, you know, we always talk about how we are trying to do everything that we can for all our residents and business owners. And I think this is just an example that we didn't need it as much as we thought we did. For those that did need it, it was important. But going forward, or not a but, and going forward, staying the course, again, means so much more than just, okay, we decided not to do that for the fall. But the stay on course for legislative requests is probably one of the most important things on this list. As you know, Madam Chair, as chair of the Legislative Committee, And then, seeking additional funding for all of the local governments as far as the lost revenue, and at a time when we need to have more funding. And so there are different parts of this that all come together. And I think that it's important that we really look at that. So, and understand that. And I think Chris, again, did a great job of laying this out. But I don't want people to focus on just one part of it, but to really look at what are we trying to do, because it all comes down to, in the end, housing stability, and especially for the folks that are trying to get into a home and trying to make it, to have that opportunity, and don't have that right now. So it's a bigger picture, and I'm done. If somebody has questions for me, but I just, again, thank all the members of the subcommittee and all the staff that worked on this, because we wouldn't have been able to do it without them. Thank you.
And I'm going to add my thanks to you, Commissioner Reinhardt, for your leadership in that committee. And yes, add my thanks to all the people that participated in that. So thank you for all your work there. And now I'm going to turn to Commissioner Mattis Castillo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for a really good presentation, Chris. You're always thorough, and you put taxes, which can be very complicated, in really simple terms. So I really appreciate that, your work. And thank you, Commissioner Reinhardt, on your leadership, because I think you understand this maybe better than anyone, and how complicated this system is. And you're right, the work was preventative in nature. It was really important, but it also showed us how the need is. And I think, as Chris has laid out, it is, we're talking about taxes, but we're also talking about who has the ability to pay and who isn't paying their taxes, and how this all relates to affordable housing. And so I really appreciate too, I hope those watching appreciate that we're talking across departments on a holistic picture, and that's really important, and it comes through even in this presentation. The one thing that I want to kind of raise—
Lines crossed.
We need to mute. Matt, do you want to
okay,
mute yourself?
that makes sense.
Matt?
Yeah, I can sit on that.
Matt Hill, you want to mute
To
yourself?
free up her calendar for that
Matt,
time, which would be good.
Matt, do you want?
I just muted all of you, so I'm going to come off of mute. That's okay, but I don't know how to do anything other than rule with an iron fist, Madam Chair.
I appreciate that. If I'd have had the mute all button, I would have used it.
That was great. I appreciate your iron fist. The one part I do want to raise and just bring, as we saw on the previous slide with, those who are eligible but didn't pay taxes necessarily were, vacant land, cell towers, and we know those big corporations obviously have the ability to pay. And Chris said this isn't, this happens often, but even the land value or vacant land is often held by people who are prospectors, right? So they've bought land as an investment and then they're not paying their taxes. And I think this really goes to the conversation and future conversations about how we look at those parcels, and maybe it's that we need to reconsider how we do land values. So, of course, we're always taxing once it's approved upon, but there almost needs to see some kind of response in that we want to motivate people to develop more housing, to develop businesses, and not just sit on land. Our land, as you know, is a hot commodity in Ramsey County. We don't have a lot of places that we can grow and expand, and we have this really high need for more housing of all kinds, of all income levels, especially affordable at the very low income levels. And so to think about how we view and appraise and assess the vacant properties or properties like cell towers to incentivize one, paying their taxes when they're due, but also to think about how we incentivize, the development of those, so that people aren't just sitting on parcels waiting, and that they're participating and thinking about it from where does that fit into affordable housing? Where does that fit into wealth building? And so, you know, this is one of those areas that I know we're crossing legislative lines and county lines when it comes to tax policy, but I just think that, you know, in the way that taxes are often regressive and they hurt our, you know, lowest income folks, there are also folks that can afford to pay their fair share. And so as we're thinking about our policy moving forward, those things seem to be highlighted here. And so maybe the need for a land value tax or appraisal differently as we move forward to incentivize just comes up as this is laid out for us. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Absolutely, Commissioner Maniscalco. I'm so glad that you brought this up. And I think from our last workshop last week, that was brought to our attention in a really stark way. And I'm glad you brought it up here. And I think we should, Madam Chair, Commissioner Carter, we should put this on the agenda for a workshop on this or whenever we are ready for it. But I think it's also coming up in another economic development workshop. But I absolutely support that effort. And I think everyone on this board would a conversation about land values and what we are giving incentives to. So thank you for articulately bringing that up. Appreciate that. And with that, Commissioner Carter, I still have your hand raised. You have another question. Thank
Yes,
you.
I just wanted to say thank you for the creative ideas that are coming out here. And I know that the county manager is going to be leaving us to move forward on some of the recommendations and thoughts that came out of a prior workshop. And I don't doubt that we will have the opportunity to visit this again. But yes, we'll look to ensure where that is teed up to come back to us. I also wanted to say thank you to Commissioner Reinhardt for accepting leadership of that property tax policy advisory group and for the work that you did with all of us and our communities. We know what we know and we don't know what we don't know. So thanks for giving us the opportunity to move forward with that framework because we do not know what's going to happen. October's here, so we're pretty secure, but we don't know what's going to happen in the coming year and 2 to 5 as we move forward in regards to things stacking up and putting pressure on future property tax payments. So we have a framework that we can use and we know what we can do should we be called upon again as we provide as much support as we can to other areas to assist with property taxes as we think through our economic development planning and all of those things focused on ensuring affordable housing and the action that we can take there. We still need to have tools such as this. So once again, thank you for the opportunity to have the tool and Chris for such great information that you've put before us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Commissioner Carter. So I'm looking to see if there's any other questions. We're almost at our desired conclusion here. I want to thank you, Director Samuel, for your wonderful presentation. As has been stated, you make it understandable to people that are not versed in this area, and we appreciate that. And just for all of your work, I want to thank Deputy County Manager Karen Francoise for your work and for all of us. Again, Commissioner Reinhardt on the Property Tax Subcommittee. So thanks to everyone here. And with that, I don't see any more questions. I will adjourn this meeting, and I know we have another workshop at 1:30. So we will adjourn this. But I'm sorry, I should give you final word remarks. Sorry, Deputy County Manager Francois. I should give you the last word, right?
Thank you so much, Madam Chair and Commissioners. Final word is, as we think about property taxes and those who are not able to pay them, we have been going through a modernization of our tax forfeited land work that we do here in Ramsey County, and we're hoping sometime early next year, working with Commissioner McGuire on our Committee of the Whole workshops to bring an update about the TFL modernization that is focused on keeping people in their homes. The other thing that we're working on with regard to TFL and property tax and affordable housing is something that you've all come to know and love, which is a passion of Chris's, and that is compassionate regulation. So Chris has begun an enterprise-wide effort to really flesh out what we mean by compassionate regulation, and a lot of these very innovative ideas that you've talked about here today, including land value tax, will be a part of that work. So look for an update on that in 2021 as well. I would like to plug, as this is the ending of the original Committee of the Whole IPR meeting, I would like to plug the fact that we are next Tuesday going to be coming to the board with an update on elections. That is Tuesday, October 20th at the board meeting. And that evening, we are having an elections town hall starting at 6 o'clock that we would like to invite each and every one of you here, board members, to attend, and all of those watching as well. We would like to extend an invitation to you to attend this meeting, to have your questions answered about elections as we get so close to November 3rd and to the ensuing days that are going to be so important after the election. Thank you on behalf of IPR for letting us come. Thank you, Chris, for a great presentation. I would also like to extend a thanks to Commissioner Reinhardt for her leadership on the subcommittee. And thanks to all of you, commissioners, for your leadership around helping to ensure that the residents of Ramsey County, of which I am one, are well taken care of during this this pandemic and all of the unrest that we are experiencing in our county and around the nation. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Deputy County Manager. Yes, you definitely needed to get the last word in. So thank you for that. And I'm not seeing any other questions. And so with that, appreciate everything, all the work everyone's doing. We will be adjourned, and we'll see you all at 1:30.